Welcome back to So You Really Want to Learn Latin, and today, as promised, we are going to be looking at temporal clauses and causal clauses. Now, there's nothing very funny about these. We've been doing them up until now without even noticing that we've been doing them. But now that we've done so much work on the subjunctive, it's a good time to just have a little look at how these clauses work in a kind of slightly more refined way to that which we've done up until now. Okay, so we'll start with temporal clauses. That's to do with time, when something happened. And just run through a couple of points which are all spelled out neatly in the book. On page 60, we are in chapter 6 of So You Really Want to Learn Latin, book 3, and with no further ado, let's have a little look at them. So the main thing about temporal clauses is that generally they use a verb in the indicative. And they come after conjunctions referring to time, such as ubi, when, postquam, after, priusquam, or antiquam, meaning before, and similatque, or sometimes just similac, which means as soon as. Now, when a temporal clause refers to the future, the thing to notice is that in English we generally follow it with a present tense, and in Latin they generally follow it with a future perfect tense. Okay, so for example, in English we say, when you come here, I'll give you some cake. Okay, when you come here, it sounds like a present tense. But if you think about it carefully, what you actually mean is in the future, okay, you haven't come yet, but in the future, when you do, I'm going to give you some cake. But I'm only going to give you the cake when you have already got here. So actually, a future perfect tense is exactly what you need. When you will have come here, then, and only then, I will give you some cake. Okay, so that is a classic use of the future perfect tense. We don't really do it in English. We just say when you come here. But we mean when you will have come here. Now, the second thing to notice is that when we're referring to the past, in English we use a pluperfect, and in Latin they use a perfect. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up really. But we will say, when he had done this, okay, when he had done this, that's a pluperfect tense in English. But in Latin, don't ask me why, they use a perfect tense. So when he had done this in Latin is ubi hoc fecit, right? Fecit, perfect tense of facio, not pluperfect. Or after he had heard this, postquam hoc audiuit. Okay, audiuit, perfect tense of audio, not the pluperfect that you're hearing in English, after he had heard this. But just to kind of throw the whole thing up into the melting pot, if the conjunction you're using is cum, meaning when or since, that conjunction is followed by a pluperfect subjunctive. So when he had heard this, okay, in English you can hear that pluperfect. In Latin you're expecting a perfect tense. But if you use cum, then it's followed by a pluperfect subjunctive. So that would be cum hoc audivisset. Okay, when he had heard this, when he heard this. Okay, and then just to round this off, where in a temporal clause, okay, you're just talking about time, where an idea other than time is introduced, and the most common idea other than time is purpose, okay, when an element of purpose creeps in, then you always use the subjunctive, okay, to indicate that you're not just talking about when it happened, you're kind of talking about why it happened. Okay, so there's an example in the book of that, where we're trying to translate the sentence, before the enemy were able to pitch camp, the general made an attack on them. Okay, so before the enemy pitched their camp, the enemy made an attack on them. Okay, now we're not really sort of just saying that is when they did it, it happened to be before the enemy pitched their camp. It's actually a kind of idea of, well, that's why they attacked them then. They attacked them before the enemy were able to pitch their camp. Okay, so in Latin, we've got priusquam hostes castra ponerent, dux impetum in eos fecit. Okay, so priusquam hostes castra ponerent. Now, priusquam is just a normal conjunction, a temporal clause type conjunction, meaning before. But because you see it being followed by the subjunctive, priusquam hostes castra ponerent, erent, okay, imperfect subjunctive. So it's before the enemy pitched their camp, castra ponerent, but subjunctive, and you're thinking, why subjunctive after priusquam? You know, it doesn't make any sense unless you're trying to introduce some idea other than time. Okay, so when you see that priusquam followed by a subjunctive, you should be thinking it doesn't just mean before in the sense of kind of before, it's something a bit more than that. Okay, and in this case, the something a bit more is, well, that's why the leader made his attack then. Okay, he did it because the enemy hadn't actually managed to pitch their camp yet. Priusquam hostes castra ponerent, dux impetum in eos fecit. Okay, so the leader made his attack on them, dux impetum in eos fecit. Okay, that's what he did. And when did he do it? Well, he did it priusquam, before. Okay, and you're thinking, well, before lunch, before supper? No, priusquam followed by a subjunctive. So it's not just when he did it, it's kind of why he did it then. Okay? So I hope I've explained that in a way that makes some kind of sense. Basically, when you're translating Latin, when you spot a subjunctive, you've always got to ask yourself, why is that verb in the subjunctive? And there will always be a reason. You don't just randomly use them. There's a reason for using the subjunctive. And in this case, after priusquam, you are using the subjunctive after priusquam to indicate that it isn't just time that is being talked about, it's something else. And you've got to supply what the something else is. You know, what other than the timing is relevant? Well, in this case, that leader made his attack before the enemy pitched their camp because he wanted to make his attack before they had pitched their camp. You know, that's why he did it then. Okay? And when you translate it into English, you've got to somehow get that sense of something other than time. So, you know, to just translate that as the leader made his attack on the enemy before they pitched their camp wouldn't really do it justice. You'd have to say something like before they were able to pitch their camp, he made the attack. Okay, right. Well, now let's have a little look at causal clauses. Okay, causal clauses, obviously these give the reason for something. Okay, and introduced in English by words like because or since. You know, because I had a headache, I did this. Or, you know, since we were all so cross, we decided to blah de blah. okay, causal clauses. In Latin, introduced by the conjunctions quod, that's our most famous one, quod meaning because. We've also got quia meaning because. Okay, there's quoniam, which means kind of since, in the sense of because, quoniam. So quod, quia, quoniam, all followed by the indicative, and all meaning because or since. Okay, but we also have cum plus the subjunctive meaning since. Okay, so again, you know, you just got to, when you see a subjunctive, you've got to ask yourself, why is it in the subjunctive? Okay, so some examples in the book. We've got Servum interfecit quod eum timebat. Okay, he killed the slave, Servum interfecit quod eum timebat, because he feared him. You know, nothing fancy there. It's just quod plus the indicative, because he feared him, quod timebat. Now, if instead of quod you wanted to use cum, then you'd have to follow that by a subjunctive, because cum plus the subjunctive means since. So, servum interfecit, cum eum timeret, right? So cum timeret is since he feared. Cum plus the imperfect subjunctive, in this case, meaning since. Okay. But then again, a little bit like the temporal clauses, there's a little twist you can put on this, and that is, if you follow a conjunction that would normally just be followed by the indicative, if you follow it with a subjunctive, then you're not just giving the reason, the cause, you're giving the alleged reason. And it's as if you're saying allegedly. Okay, so in our happy little tale about the slave killing going on, servum interfecit, he killed the slave. Quoniam, now that would normally be followed by an indicative. Quoniam eum timeret would be, he killed the slave allegedly because he feared him. And you can imagine ... but actually I think it was just because he kind of hated him, or, you know, wanted to kill a slave or whatever. Okay, so temporal clauses, nice and easy, normally followed by the indicative, using words like quod, quoniam, quia, or cum plus the subjunctive, meaning since, or if a normal conjunction is followed by a subjunctive, then you're not just giving the cause, you're giving the alleged cause. Okay, right, now there is more in the book on cum. Cum is a bit of a pig, really. Cum, as you know, can be a preposition meaning with, but it's also a conjunction meaning when or since, or even although. And, you know, it's a tricky little fellow. It's worth just having a little look to see, you know, all the possible uses of cum followed by a verb, because it can be followed by the imperfect subjunctive, it can be used followed by the pluperfect subjunctive. It can even be used followed by the indicative, when what it actually means is whenever. Okay, so cum plus a perfect indicative tense would mean whenever he did something. Okay, so have a little look at that. You know, it's quite fun. Okay, now that's pretty much it for chapter 6. You know, just flicking to the end, I see we've got 2 more irregular verbs to look at. I kind of feel I've told you that we've finished with irregular verbs, so I'm a little bit reluctant to spend too much time on them. You know, we've got the verb edo, meaning I eat. It is a bit silly. Principal parts, edo asi, adi asum, meaning I eat. I mean, the great thing about it is it's so easy to confuse it with the verb sum. you know, I mean, its present infinitive is AC with a long E, not to be confused with esse, meaning to be. Now, you know, it means I eat. So normally the context makes it pretty jolly clear what's going on. But you know, there we go. It's worth having a little look at. Okay, now the full conjugation of this verb is set out in the book on page 120. So if you haven't got the book, have a quick look. You know, most of its forms are regular, but as I say, it is entirely possible to confuse it with the verb to be, and it's only the length of the vowel that saves you. If you only see it written down, it's not so obvious. I mean, one of the great tests, I'll just break off to tell you this, back in the day when, you know, Latin was done very, very seriously in school, there was a classic sort of test that they would give pupils to check that they were kind of on the ball. And that is, they would just ask them to translate puer malum est. Okay, now it was written down. It looked like puer malum est. It was actually pronounced puer malum est, but you know, you wouldn't have known that if it was just written on the blackboard. And you were asked to translate it. Well, you know, anyone who just went thundering in there and said, oh, that's easy, it means the boy is bad, would be kind of taken out and horsewhipped or whatever. It clearly couldn't mean that, because that would have been puer malus est. You know, malus agreeing with puer. So puer malum est is clearly something different. And to get it right, you sort of have to know a couple of things. You have to know that est, as well as meaning he is, can also be the present tense of edo, and it means eats, so the boy eats. And you also need to know that malum is a neuter noun meaning an apple. Okay, and if you know that, you're in good shape, because it means the boy eats the apple. But that's just a little thing about edo which is worth knowing. The other verb, which I'm not going to spend very long on, is fio. Fio fieri factus sum, which means I become. It's kind of like the passive of facio, I am made. Okay, and it's, you know, got some kind of, they're called defective forms, where forms are missing, but so we've had to put them in brackets in the book because you never see them. But it's kind of going fio, fis, fit, femus, fetus, with those are in brackets, fiunt, and that means I become, you become, he, sure, it becomes. Okay. It's got a lovely little present subjunctive, fiam, fias, fiat, fiamus, fiatis, fiant. And that's cool because you often see mottos such as fiat lux, let there be light, fiat lux. Literally that means may light become. Okay, so it's a kind of verb you see in certain contexts, not very common, you know, but worth having a look at. It's on page 64 in the book if you want to have a little look. Okay. Right, now that is enough for now. Next time we are going to move on into chapter 7, but we might, before we do that, just have a little revision session, whack through a few sentences, just to get used to seeing these subjunctives in action, before we move on to our next construction, which is going to be indirect command. Okay, so until then, keep up the good work on the Latin. Do subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you back here very soon.